So, as Saturday morning cartoons used to say, time for something completely different. So, I'm going to talk about how the brain works. I'm not going to get into how to do brain surgery. That's not really what this audience is for. But things that we've learned in the process of doing brain surgery, and hopefully what I'm going to leave everyone with is an alphabet or a descriptive language that we can talk about the brain accurately and really put some science and words behind some of the things people are talking about. So, obviously, I have probably one of the strangest paths to get on the stage at a psychedelic conference. I've done thousands of brain surgeries. I'm actually probably the only person in this conference who's ever caused a mental illness with my bare hands. And we've been working on how to avoid this in surgery for a very long time. And this is sort of why we got into this branch point. I became one of the world's experts on how the cognitive system's anatomy works, written many books about it. And I got a reputation for being the person who runs into buildings on fire when everyone's running the other direction. How I got here, though, was a couple years ago, I saw an article that basically had this facts, and I think everyone in this room is probably aware of the disaster that's happened. And ultimately, I felt that if we had a serial killer teeing off on teenage girls to the extent that we're accepting here, we would burn the city down to find them. And I really felt that my particular skill set could branch into this. And ultimately, as I became more familiar with the extent of the problem, I think that one of the things we have to be aware of is that we can't possibly train enough people to scale the existing ineffective solutions that we have. We have to basically tackle the problem the way it really is. And so we blame, these things for that peak. And yeah, it seems like a good, explanation of it, but there's been a lot of stressors over time. And I think that what we have to do, first and foremost, is we can't lie to ourselves about the reality of what's really causing this. This is a stressor, but that's the cause. Healthy brains do not generate suicidal thoughts, period. So when we start thinking about causes of suicide of an individual, a group of people, or whatever, we have to track it back to the same thing. There's something happening to the brains of people that cause them to do that. And we've studied it for many years using advanced MRI techniques. For those of you who are not familiar with these kind of techniques, the one on the left is a really good advertisement that the Mayo Clinic has. We've been doing this for a long time. It's a type of MRI called DTI that shows the connections of the brain. And on the right, it shows the function of the brain. It's called functional MRI. Because we can actually look at the activity patterns of the brain and see the brain active. And so this is something that I've worked for a very long time on. And I decided to actually dive into the world of entrepreneurship. And what we ultimately did is we built a platform that actually has cleared the FDA twice now, but we're also building other tools that work in parallel to this. And what we're able to do is actually look at the brain of an individual person and utilize artificial intelligence to make sense of this extremely complex data set. So we started thinking about, when I became familiar with AI many years ago, is that we're using it for things that don't matter that much, like how do we do better home loans? And we're not tackling something that really matters. So we built really big scale hyperclusters to crank at large amounts of data to try to interpret the brain. And that's underlying some of the technology I showed. So I'm going to kind of show some of the things that we figured out, that other people have figured out, and really what I call the great mysteries. And these are mysteries that were brought up to me in medical school when I was at Columbia, and ultimately have really stuck with us for a long time. Which is, if everyone has the same diagnosis, why do they not respond to the same medicines? So if you have a broken bone, a cast works every single time. So why is that the case? And why do people have different symptoms? Completely different collections of symptoms with the same diagnosis. And finally, why do we give people 5 diagnoses when they first come in? Well, I'd argue that all of these result from the same problem. And finally, I'll talk about what we've learned about what causes this stuff in the first place and how we can begin to think about to really tackle this issue on a bigger level. So ultimately, we have to acknowledge that, like it or not, we're stuck with this organ, which has some amazing capabilities, but ultimately everything we experience, from suicidal thoughts to pleasure to joy to everything, happens here. And what's really held us back is the fact that we don't really understand everything about how this works. And this isn't because people haven't tried to figure this out. Some of these studies, for example, go back to 150 years. But despite that, this is the kind of diagram I was taught in medical school. And you can see that we figured out where language and motor is in the human brain, but we didn't figure out what all the rest of the stuff's doing. And we kind of know that it's cognitive or emotional, but we've been very limited. And part of the reason is we didn't have, until very recently, the firepower to interpret this kind of data. So this is the fruit fly brain, just recently published. These are all the physical connections of the fruit fly. Now, that's interesting. It took about 8 years, and the amount of data in these files is actually more data than the entire world produced in all forms of text, songs, books, internet, up until about 1998. That's a much bigger scale of comparison than what we're dealing with when we tackle humans. We have 10 million times more connections. So, staggering problem. And it seems that ultimately the only way we can disentangle this extremely complex set of wiring is to really throw artificial intelligence at this. Now, this is an extremely small part of the brain. This is about 100 nanometers across. And you can see all the wires and all the connections. And it seems like this would be impossible to learn anything about. But there's one thing that nature did for us that's actually pretty useful, is that these cells couple, they work as a unit. And that means that we can look at it at the macroscopic scale and actually learn something about how the brain works. And one of the things that's come out of the last couple years is the concept of brain networks. And this is actually going to be very important to this particular conference. And where brain networks come from is the observation that when you look at MRI data about brain activity, there are parts of the brain that are not next to each other that have very similar activity, meaning they're often firing together, and usually this is because they're doing something in common. So when we lay in an MRI or just go about your daily business, the brain is cycling through lots and lots of brain states. And while there's some variability in this, the same things keep happening over and over again. And we can study that. We can look at that statistically. And more importantly, and this is really the thing that got me particularly excited about it, is that while all of us will have different thoughts, you may be thinking about baseball or psychedelics or whatever you're thinking about, and different parts of the brain are going to be activated, we all have a substantial bit of this in common, about 85%. And more importantly, people with mental illness have misfirings. And this has been shown in literally thousands of studies. The challenge is not, are there misfirings in the brain? We know that's true. It's that what we found is that there are so many different ways that this happens that it really blows up the idea of a diagnosis like depression. There isn't such a thing. There's depressions, probably hundreds. And so ultimately, if you take the line from Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. But as we begin to understand this, we start to look into the black box of what are these other areas of the brain doing. So some of these are things that we've known for a long time, like how you move your arm or how you speak. But we've also started to learn how you hold, what parts of the brain are involved with attention, changing attention or holding attention. We've learned the multitasking networks of the brain, the memory parts, but what really is most interesting are the executive parts, the decision-making, and this relatively important network called the default mode network. For this audience, this should be the thing you take home more than anything, because what caused the medical community to begin to take things like psilocybin seriously is the evidence that what these drugs do is decouple the default mode network from the rest of the brain for a period of time. And the default mode network, number one, is where you think to yourself, it's your ego, your sense of self. But more importantly, it's abnormal in a wide variety of mental illnesses. So you have a mechanism that actually makes sense. And this is what really changed the tide of it. Now, when we start to look at this, the wiring underlying these networks happens very early in embryonic development. We can begin to see some of this and start to see the patterns that are going to emerge as we emerge into adulthood. And so ultimately, what causes these networks is a couple things. Number one, the wiring. Different parts of the brain connect to each other, and thus they're prone to talking to each other in certain ways. The neurochemicals, the serotonin, the dopamine, etc., they change the gains. They change how B and C interact with each other, for example. And ultimately, there's a huge number of different waveforms and things going on in the brain simultaneously. This gets very complex very quickly, But the end result is that in some people, because of the wiring, the neurochemicals, or the signals, B and C start firing in ways that don't happen in people who have healthy brains. And that ultimately has been found many, many times. We're still learning all the patterns, and there may be more patterns than we can really group effectively into simple categories. And why this matters, why these misfirings matter, is that ultimately the brain uses a series of states to represent reality. Everything we perceive in reality is dependent on these states being formed correctly. So let's say, for example, I see someone coming at me and coming towards me. I don't know whether they're a threat or not. There's parts of the brain that interpret the vision, identify the person, determine who they are, determine all the other things in the area, determine whether you think this is a good or bad thing, what's your emotional state, context. And all of these are the brain state at one time point. And ultimately, as we go through that series of events, there are different brain states. Now, this is how the brain represents reality. And it makes sense that if you're representing that inappropriately, for example, you can't do certain parts of that brain state, that your representation of reality in your mind is going to be inaccurate. Just like you can't run on a broken leg, if I can't have the appropriate response to the signal of events, I'm basically doing things that aren't really normal. And so ultimately, our experience is a series of brain states constantly activating in the brain. And this is representing what's going on. In this paper from Japan that I've quoted many times, they've even figured out what are emotions. And what we found is that they're actually components of the brain that are in certain on or off states at a given time point. Different emotion, different things on. What I hope that you can get out of this is they're highly complicated. There's lots of parts of the brain. And what we perceive as an emotion is actually a lot of parts of the brain set to a particular state. And in fact, they've done this for every human emotion. There's actually 24 distinct emotions, and they have different states. And so this really highlights the fact that ultimately, states are the representation of our reality, of our emotions, and of everything that we experience. Now, how does that happen? How do we get the brain into these states? And I think this is really where the revolution in psychiatry is going, and it's not just my opinion, it's a lot of people's opinion. So if we look at a state, there are parts of the brain that focus on our decision making, maybe 20 to 30 parts. There's parts that decide, is this a good or bad thing? Should I do this? Is it going to be rewarding? Do I feel good about what's happening? Other parts that just interpret sensation. And the sum of all those circuits is the one state. Now, as we've begun to look at the diagnostic categories for mental illness, and this is opinion of many psychiatrists, I'm not a psychiatrist, this is what people tell me, but I think I agree with it. In many cases, the existing categorizations are aggregations of things that people have in common. So we say, well, this is a disease because we see these events cluster together. But the fact that we need a disease like schizoaffective disorder because some people also have depression highlights that it really is different symptoms in different combinations. And so where NIH and a lot of people have begun taking the field is towards a more transdiagnostic approach. So let's say, for example, there are 30 potential symptoms someone can have. Well, theoretically, that symptom is going to result from some circuit in the brain misfiring. If that misfires, when you go to call on it, it doesn't do what you expect it to do. And more importantly, it's irrelevant what diagnosis you give someone. The circuit is the problem, because that's the representation of reality. And ultimately, finding those circuits and locating them is important, because if we can locate it, we can study it, we can ground what we're doing in real biology, and we can do stuff about it. So let's talk about one circuit, just to give everyone an idea why transdiagnostic approaches make a lot of sense, and why talking about circuits is more fulfilling than talking in vague terms. So there's a circuit called reward probability. What that circuit does is it talks to the reward system, like the nucleus accumbens, and makes a judgment. Is something likely to happen good if I do this thing? Well, if that circuit always gives me a no answer, my thoughts are, nothing good will ever happen to me. Life is terrible. Well, guess what? I think everyone in this room knows what that means. But let's say it always gives you a yes answer. Well, then you start thinking everything's good is going to happen, even if there's no reason to believe that. Again, that's also not normal. The normal function of the reward probability circuit is normal. And so we've spent a lot of time trying to really figure out where in the brain these things are located. And we did this first by AI, first by looking at imaging, but also using the wisdom of thousands of research papers people have, and really locating it to exactly where in the brain that is. And what we get is this gigantic diagram. If you look at the top, these are all different brain circuits that are relevant to mental illness. It's kind of daunting. So I spent a lot of time thinking about how to use this, because ultimately, this is very powerful, but it's also very complex, and it's not very accessible. But we also know, fundamentally, I think hopefully I've convinced everyone in the room, that underlying this is the secret to what we're looking for. We are never going to tackle the problem unless we talk about it the way it really is. Because if I can look at the reward probability circuit and say that it's not firing correctly, well then, we might be able to say, well, this is what we should focus on. Or maybe we aim medicines at it, or stimulation at it, or do psychotherapy in addressing it. And that's critical. I think one of the things that we should also start thinking about is, while we can always obviously think about modulating this biologically, Aaron Beck, who really was the pioneer behind CBT, really had a brilliant observation. And I'm not a psychotherapist, I just learned about this because I thought it was important. And he basically took the Freudian stuff, threw it out, because the goal wasn't to understand what was the cause, because they couldn't. Obviously, there's no way they could have in 1964. He focused on the fact that thoughts came into your head that you didn't have control of. And all you could do is figure out how to react to that correctly. Now, biology might be able to change those, but ultimately, the automatic negative thoughts he was talking about, we now think of as circuit malfiring. That forces a thought into your head, whether you want it there or not. And ultimately, this kind of focusing on problems and learning how to deal with it is ultimately what the basis of CBT, what's worked. So what we basically created was a tool that was a knowledge tool for looking at brain circuits and leveraging a vast literature on how to do therapy, how to target medicine at that. We call this ClearTome. We're in the process of launching it. So you get an MRI, and then when you're done with it, it's process your scan using the AI tools. This is a ChatGPT app that allows you to look at your own brain and ask a question. For example, why do I not understand other people? And we can show you that circuit. It will link to that circuit and tell you the misfiring. So the question is it real what you're experiencing? Is it actually biologic, or should you focus on something else? We know that people with mental illness often have a long list of issues, and we can't address all of them. So we want to focus on the ones that are actually abnormal. But it's not just enough to show people stuff. We didn't want this to be a cute tool. We wanted it to move the goalpost. In order to do that, you have to be able to do something about it. And I spent a tremendous amount of time organizing tens of thousands of pieces of information, reading tons of papers. We put a knowledge base behind it. What are all the ways that you can do therapy for a specific circuit? So reward probability. You can actually train people to do that better. What we did is we set up where ChatGPT generates a plan. This is what you should focus on. Here's the strategies on how to do it. And more importantly, it also links to a database we have of the expression of every neurotransmitter in the brain and whether it's in that circuit or not. If we give an SSRI or we give anything, if it doesn't normalize the circuit, it doesn't make the symptom go away. Full stop, because that's the mechanism of the problem. So we think that linked to the interventional tools that we've taken through FDA, this creates a platform across all of mental health, which is, again, not just mixing and matching existing treatments, but really changes the game, because we're really looking at the problem. So finally, if there are genetic components to these diseases, like schizophrenia is heavily genetic, we know depression has genetic components, there's a nature and nurture component. Why do we not see this till adulthood? It's a great mystery. And in order to understand this mystery, you have to think about states, and this has significant ramifications for the future of how we think about society. So we think about our brain going through states. What we have to understand is that some states are easier to get the brain into than others. So if you look at this diagram here, let's say you're wired this way. The upper transition is easy. It takes 2 inputs. Lower transition, hard. It takes a lot of energy. And so we can quantify that. We can look at every state. We create this plot. Now, this plot's a lot more complicated than this, but this is for schematic purposes. And the peak of that is how hard is it to get the brain into that state. So if we think about life, we're just doing this. We're wandering the landscape. And sometimes we can get our brain into a hard state. Now, how do we get our brain into hard states? Well, this landscape is determined by the wiring, the neurotransmitters, and the signals, as we talked before. This is where that comes from. But why do we not, again, if genetics drives the neurotransmitters and the wiring, why do we not see it until we see adolescence? Well, it's simple. These two networks don't start maturing until you're about 12 and continue maturing till you're 30. And what they do is they help your brain climb the peak. Now, what if you're wired differently? For example, that guilt peak is so low that you get to it almost no matter what, whether you're trying or not. Well, let's say that joy peak is impossible to get your brain into that state. Well, it doesn't happen. You never get up there. Now, what really starts to make all hell break loose is when this entire landscape becomes part of your life. And it does that as part of the maturing process. But I think what we can really point out is that given it's driven by the wiring diagram, we can begin to start to see things that are happening in childhood, and we have data on this and many other groups too, that are beginning to say that some kids are wired to be depressed later in life. The ramifications of that are pretty profound, and how we handle that in an ethical way really is a good question. But it's starting to become clear from lots of studies there's probably something that we can see before it happens. But I think one of the key things is this. We could get rid of every smartphone tomorrow. Healthy landscapes do not lead to suicidal thoughts, period. So if we want to change the problem, we need to think about how do we change the biology. Thanks, everyone.